Hello everyone, it's Miss Smith talking to you today about the next Keats poem in our collection in the anthology, Isabella or the Pot of Basil. So I'm going to go through the PowerPoint that your teachers sent out to you, and I'll tell you when to pause and attempt a task, and then when you come back to us I'll talk you through some of the ideas that I might have been thinking about when I put the lesson together. So your first question here is asking you to think about Isabella or the Pot of Basil in comparison with the other two poems that we've looked at. So in comparison with La Belle Dame Sans Merci and The Eve of St Agnes, and here you've got an image to represent Isabella. So your question is, what links the titles of our poems so far? So I'll give you a few minutes to have a think about that, and then if you press play again when you're ready, I'll talk you through some of my ideas. So you've probably come up with all sorts of ideas, which I'd love to hear, but unfortunately I can't. But for me, the obvious one is that Keats is drawing attention to the role of the female protagonist in each of his titles. Here we've got La Belle Dame, we've got St Agnes, and we've got Isabel. So even though St Agnes isn't actually a character, she's a figure in the poem, we've got the influence of the feminine and the spiritual there. With Isabella, we've got a really precise character. We know that Isabella is going to be the character in this poem, and the story is going to be about her and what happens to her. And La Belle Dame, we've got a reference to a female figure, but there's a greater sense of ambiguity about her, and indeed by the end of the poem we're still kind of she's still quite a mysterious figure to the reader, very interesting one. So with all of the titles we're being presented with a female figure immediately at the heart of the experience that's going to be presented in the poem, which you'll have noticed the prominence of women in these poems so far, and we'll be coming back to that in later lessons as we go on. Okay, I'll just give you a moment to pause there in case you want to jot anything down. Okay, so moving on again, you've got a selection of images to look at and a song if you want to click on that one. It's quite an old one, but I'm hoping you'll enjoy it. So have a listen to the song and have a think about the images, and I want you to think about why I might have chosen them for you and how they might connect to the poem that we're going to focus on this lesson. What do you think Keats might be writing about that these images and this song are pointing to? Okay, so if you do that now and again, you can press play when you're ready to move on. So I'm hoping that when you were looking at those images, you were thinking about love, young love in particular, obsession perhaps, thwarted or doomed love, lovers who are separated and can't be together for whatever reason. Perhaps they're forbidden to be together, like in Romeo and Juliet. Perhaps it's a class issue or a money issue, but that idea of separation. All of these kinds of things are familiar concepts for readers of Keats's own life or readers of his poetry, and they're stories that have proved popular throughout the ages. Bound up with all of these ideas is the idea of grief and suffering being a huge part of love, and that they kind of at times go hand in hand. I've put the image there of Keats and Fanny Brawne, which you'll recognise from the film Bright Star. And there, that's just to make you think about the idea of love and separation and suffering, but I'm not suggesting to you that there's a direct connection between Isabella and the Pot of Basil and Keats and Fanny Brawne's relationship, because this poem was written in 1818, which is really before their relationship started to blossom in the way that it did. Okay, I'll pause again in case you want to jot anything down, and you can pick up when you're ready. Okay, so your next task before we go on to look at the poem in detail is to do a little bit of research. So when you're ready to pause the video, you can research Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, okay, which is one of the main sources for Keats's work on this poem. So see what you can find out about that poem, see what you can find out about what the stories are about in that text and what elements Keats is borrowing for his work, and make sure that you make a note of those things. And again, when you're ready, if you press play, you can come back to the presentation. Okay, so I'm hoping that your research will have helped you on your way to finding out everything that's going to be listed on the next slide. So some of the things that I want you to focus on should be coming up in a moment. Okay, so your research should perhaps have helped you find out a little bit about character, setting, plot, theme, and you might be already thinking about where the tragedy lies in relation to this particular poem. I'm going to suggest to you that for the rest of today's lesson you try to organise your notes under those headings. I think it'll kind of help you find your way through the poem and provide you with useful notes to revise from in the future and help you to organise your thoughts. You are going to come across words that you might not have come across before as we read this poem, so there'll be some references to mythology and things like that, so make sure that you look those things up, because I'm not necessarily going to define everything for you, so make sure you look them up and annotate them on your anthology as you go, or jot them down in your notes. Okay, so before we start to look at the poem together, I've found some images for you that are connected with the poem. So your next task when I've finished speaking is to have a good look at these images. Some of them you might have seen before. There's one placed particularly prominently in Newcastle somewhere, which you might have seen before. I'm not going to tell you where, see if you can find out. Have a look at these images and have a think about what they are suggesting about these key ideas of character, setting, plot, theme and tragedy. And try to bring in your knowledge of the other poems and of the kinds of things that Keats writes about, and things that he keeps coming back to help you. So have a good look and add some extra ideas to your notes about these images. The one in the middle is particularly interesting, and we'll come back to that in a later lesson. Okay, so moving on then, let's get into the poem together. So let's read the first stanza together, now that you've had a look at some images and you've done a little bit of research. So this is how the poem begins. Fair Isabel, poor simple Isabel, Lorenzo, a young palmer in love's eye, they could not in the self-same mansion dwell without some stir of heart, some malady. They could not sit at meals but feel how well it soothed each to be the other by. They could not sure beneath the same roof sleep, but to each other dream and nightly weep. So let's have a think about this in a little bit more detail together. Okay, so again, I'm going to prompt you to think about those key ideas of character, setting, plot, theme, and tragedy. Okay, you've already got some ideas from your research about what Keats might have borrowed from Boccaccio and what he might be writing about. So can you take a few moments to just jot down your initial thoughts in relation to that opening stanza, please? And again, you can press play when you're ready to move on. So some things that I was thinking about, we've got the immediate introduction of the young lovers and the clear focus immediately on the strength of feeling between them. We've also immediately got this idea of the link between love and suffering, and this idea that they feel content and happy when they're next to each other, when they're under the same roof or near to each other, but feel a kind of sense of despair We hear that they nightly weep when they are separated at night time. And we've got this familiar idea that's an idea that romantic poets return to again and again, Keats in particular, of dreaming, and we've seen the power of dreams in some of his other poems, but he comes back to it here, the idea that they dream of each other and they weep for each other when they are parted. So that's something for you to think about. We've also the first introduction to Isabel, fair, so beautiful Isabel, but simple, innocent Isabel, and the idea of Lorenzo being a young farmer, that idea of him being like a pilgrim, that he is devoted to her. And the other thing that we get an impression of here, which you probably need to jot down if you haven't thought of already, is that idea of setting. They could not in the self-same mansion dwell, so we've got a kind of rich, lavish setting, a space in this poem that denotes wealth and high status. That's going to be important later on. Okay, so I'll just give you a moment to jot down anything that you hadn't thought of, or to have a little bit of a think again. And again, when you're ready, if you press play, and we'll move on. Okay, so I'm going to give you some time now to have a look at language and semantic fields in the poem, or in the early stages of the poem. So what you need to do is to have a look at the words on the slide and categorise those words in any way that you think is fit. Make sure that you do a little key for yourself, so that later on when you revise and you can come back and think about, you can remember what you were thinking at the time. Okay, so if you do that now and then have a think about what you notice about any patterns or anything that's occurring to you as you go, and then press play when you want to come back to me and we'll talk about some more ideas. Okay, so there's a few different types of groups that you could have had, but I was thinking about some of the obvious ones. Obviously, words relating to love, words relating to sadness. So we've got love, we've got delight, we've got longing, we've got passion, and then we've got the sad words: sad, malady, dreary, winter, grief, misery. So you've got that kind of clear opposition in the language there, and in those two groups. We've also got words that kind of a sort of subcategory relating to love, really, of lust or longing that you might have had. You might connect to obsession, things like passion, longing, beauty might go into that category. And again, we've got words to do with suffering, haven't we? We've got sick, we've got sad, malady, we've got misery, anguish, dreary, grief. It's interesting that the words, when there's words to do with suffering, Keats often brings ideas of sickness in with it, which makes us, coupled with some of his images to do with sort of skin colour and blushing and things like that, and references to the body, reminds us of the idea that Keats was training to be a surgeon and had medical training, and he often kind of uses imagery to do with sickness and disease in the body and things like that. So keep those things in mind. You can look out for those things across the poems. Other groups, you might have simply just separated them into positive or negative words. That's certainly there as well. Or you might have oppositions. So if you think about, we've got words like misery and delight, we've got morning and night, and we've got winter and summer. So that you can see that oppositions is quite clearly a group there, which is interesting, really. And this is an early task that's given us an insight into Keats's use of language, but it's also encouraging us to think about how Keats might use oppositions to structure his poem as well. So you can have a little think as we go on about how he's kind of using phases of happiness versus phases of sadness, and those kinds of oppositions as we go. Okay, so moving on. The next task, I was going to ask you to read the poem on your own, but I think I will read it with you because it's quite tricky. I know to read a long poem on your own and make sense of it, and I think sometimes it is helpful to hear it. So I will read it and you can follow along in your copy of the anthology. Bear with us if I'm stumbling over any of the words. Okay. Fair Isabel, poor simple Isabel, Lorenzo, a young palmer in love's eye, they could not in the self-same mansion dwell without some stir of heart, some melody. They could not sit at meals but feel how well it soothed each to be the other by. They could not, sure, beneath the same roof sleep, but each the other dream and nightly weep. With every morn their love grew tenderer, with every eve deeper and tenderer still. He might not in house, field, or garden stir, but her full shape would all his seeing fill. And his continual voice was pleasanter to her than noise of trees or hidden rill. Her lute string gave an echo of his name, she spoilt her half-done broidery with the same. He knew whose gentle hand was at the latch before the door had given her to his eyes, and from her chamber window he would catch her beauty further than the falcon spies. And constant as a vesper's would he watch, because her face was turned to the same skies, and with sick longing all the night outwear to hear her morning step upon the stair. I'll just pause there for a second because there's some things to point out to you that are interesting. So there's a lot of sensory language, lots of language to do with them looking at each other and seeing each other, that he watches for her and looks for her at the window, that he can hear her. So there's a lot of attention paid to sound and to sight there, and the idea of this, that they're kind of obsessed with each other, they can't stop thinking about each other. She kind of spoils her embroidery because she's thinking about him and she can't focus. There's also that sensory imagery in stanza 2 about how she loves to listen to his voice and she finds it really pleasant, more pleasant than nature. So there's all of that early imagery again, which you might have noticed in some of Keats's other poetry, all this sensory, beautiful sensory imagery, very rich. Okay, moving on into the 4th stanza. A whole long month of May in this sad plight made their cheeks paler by the break of June. Tomorrow will I bow to my delight, tomorrow will I ask my lady's boon. Oh, may I never see another night, Lorenzo, if thy lips breathe not love's tune. So spake they to their pillows, but alas, hurryless days and days did he let pass, until sweet Isabella's untouched cheek fell sick within the rose's just domain, fell thin as a young mother's who doth seek by every lull to cool her infant's pain. How ill she is, said he, I may not speak, and yet I will, and tell my love all plain. If looks speak love laws, I will drink her tears, and at the last 'twill startle off her cares. So said he one fair morning, and all day his heart beat awfully against his side, and to his heart he inwardly did pray for power to speak, but still the ruddy tide stifled his voice and pulsed resolve away, fevered his high conceit of such a bride, yet brought him to the meekness of a child. Alas, when passion is both meek and wild. So once more he had waked and anguished a dreary night of love and misery, if Isabel's quick eye had not been wed to every symbol on his forehead high. She saw it waxing very pale and dead, and straight, all flushed, so lisped tenderly, Lorenzo. Here she ceased her timid quest, but in her tone and look he read the rest. So again, I'll pause just for a moment. So from stanza 4, we get this idea of them suffering, that they haven't proclaimed their love for one another, that they sort of suffer in silence and moan into their pillows in the evening, their dreams for each other and what they want to say to each other, but they don't say anything for a long while. Keats is kind of making us wait really before they proclaim their love for each other, and we get this idea again, a common idea in poetry of this genre, the idea that the lover kind of withers away, pining for their love, until Lorenzo resolves to speak to her and declare his passion, and he's given confidence to do that, because he feels like she's about to say the same thing to him. But you'll notice that all of these ideas, as we build up to this suggestion that they're going to speak their true feelings for each other, is kind of phrased in language to do with suffering and misery. It's not pleasurable, and it's not kind of light-hearted, this romance. It's very much in that tradition of love being associated with suffering, suffering for your love. Okay, and giving it that kind of high status because of that. Okay, so it's that kind of the idea of the romance and the courtly notions of romance, that idea to suffer and to long for your love before gaining it. Okay, so he perceives that she is feeling the same way as him, and he's given confidence by that. So in line 56, he plucks up the courage to speak, and that takes us into the next stanza. Okay. O Isabella, I can half perceive that I may speak my grief into thine ear. If thou didst ever anything believe, believe how I love thee, believe how near my soul is to its doom. I would not grieve thy hand by unwelcome pressing, I would not fear thine eyes by gazing, but I cannot live another night and not my passion shrive. Love, thou art leading me from wintry cold. Lady, thou leadest me to a summer clime, and I must taste the blossoms that unfold in its ripe warmth this gracious morning time. So said, his erewhile timid lips grew bold, and posied with hers in dewy rhyme. Great bliss was with them, and great happiness grew like a lusty flower in June's caress. Parting, they seemed to tread upon the air, twin roses by the zephyr blown apart, only to meet again more close and share the inward fragrance of each other's heart. She to her chamber gone, a ditty fair sang of delicious love and honeyed dart. He with light steps went up a western hill, and bade the sun farewell, and joyed his fill. All close they met again before the dusk had taken from the stars its pleasant veil. All close they met all eves before the dusk had taken from the stars its pleasant veil. Close in a bower of hyacinth and musk, unknown of any, free from whispering tale. Ah, better had it been for ever so, than idle ears should pleasure in their woe. Were they unhappy then? It cannot be. Too many tears for lovers have been shed. Too many sighs give we to them in fee. Too much of pity after they are dead. Too many doleful stories do we see, whose matter in bright gold were best to be read, except in such a page where Theseus' spouse over the pathless waves towards him bows. But for the general award of love, the little sweet doth kill much bitterness, though Dido silent is in undergrove, and Isabella's was a great distress. Though young Lorenzo in warm Indian clove was not embalmed, this truth is not the less. Even bees, the little almsmen of spring bowers, know there is richest juice in poison flowers. Okay, I'll pause there before I go on and talk about it a little bit more, for you to just jot down any ideas that you've got about the characters of Isabella and Lorenzo, the plot that's unfolding, how Keats is presenting the theme of love, and anything that you've noticed about this setting. And I should have added, but I haven't, I should have added a bullet point for tragedy there to that slide, so if you can continue to add to your notes on tragedy as well. Okay, so I'll give you as much time as you need, really, and if you can join us again when you've finished by pressing play. Okay, so there's obviously a lot going on that we could talk about in 13 stanzas, and we're not going to talk about everything today. We'll come back to some of these ideas and some of the structural features that Keats is using next lesson. But what's really clear is that we've got two young lovers who've delighted in each other's companies, enjoyed seeing each other and hearing each other. We've talked about the important sensory imagery that Keats is using and how he often uses that in his other poetry as well. And you can keep looking out for that. But they seem to have gone a long time without admitting to each other that they've got these strong feelings for each other. So we get all of this imagery that Keats is using, that he's building up of suffering and pining after each other, and withering away because of the abstinence. And again, we've seen Keats talking about ideas of abstinence in some of his other poetry. We hear in line 23, memorably, about Lorenzo's sick longing, and we hear the references to the honeyless days and days that he let pass. So this idea that the only pleasures that they derive are being in each other's company, but even then it's not a fulsome pleasure because of their kind of private feelings. And there are also these references to Isabella falling sick and thin in stanza 5. And we can see all of those words from that earlier activity that we did, looking at the semantic fields, those words to do with tears, anguish, misery. Okay, so we've got all of those words to do with suffering, sadness, sorrow, misery. Okay, the delight in each other is there. You know, we do get a sense of them falling in love, and we do get a sense of them having strong feelings for each other and passion and taking delight in that. But for me, I don't know about how you feel, for me it's the overwhelming sense at the beginning of the poem is one of suffering and pain. So this is important structurally. I mentioned to you before that Keats is using these oppositions, so we get this these oppositions between love and suffering and pain at the beginning, but he really builds up the sense of pain perhaps then, so that we can get a sense of happiness in love in a few stanzas time. Okay, because he's really this sense of suffering kind of comes to a release in stanza 7 when Lorenzo, after going through a great night of suffering for his love, declares his feelings for Isabella. So we've got this period of prolonged suffering, and then we get the delight of the love. So you can see that structural opposition that's taken place. Okay. So he tells her at the beginning of stanza 9 as well, love, thou art leading me from wintry cold, lady, thou leadest me to summer clime. And we can see how Keats again is using these oppositions, not only in language here, but in structure, because of the movement and the shifts of the poem here. We'll move into a period which is a brief period of happiness, where they are treading upon the air, we are told, and where Isabella is singing of delicious love and honeyed dart. So we get this after a period of suffering, we get this period of lightness, of these images of honey and of air, kind of almost seem cliched images now, but images that give a kind of lightness and a sense of hope and a sense of joy and pleasure that wasn't always there at the very beginning of the poem. Stanzas 11 to 13, however, immediately go on to foreshadow something dark, and the narrative voice seems to urge a note of caution for the reader. We'll talk more about the narrative voice and that kind of intrusive narrator that we've got in another lesson, but certainly we can pick up on a sense of foreboding. Okay, so Keats has kind of led us to this moment of brief happiness, but all of the references to suffering and to this kind of insistence on nighttime, darkness and sickness throughout is clearly foreshadowing the tragedy that's to come for these young lovers. Okay, so I'll give you some time to have a think about that in a little bit more detail. I've said quite a lot there. You might want to go back and play it again if you missed anything, and just jot anything down. Okay, and then if you want to have a go at the tasks on slides 11 and 12, I'll join you again on slide 13 and we'll pull together some of our thoughts on the poem so far. 11 and 12 are really a chance for you to just kind of think for yourself without me interrupting you. So I'll join you when you're ready on slide 13. Okay, so we're back looking at the images from the very beginning of the lesson of these young or doomed lovers who have suffered for their love, who've been obsessed, perhaps like Lorenzo or Isabella, who've maybe experienced obsession like some of you might have experienced obsession in your lives. You might be kind of reading this poem thinking you fully appreciate what Lorenzo and Isabella are going through. And we've got the idea of some of these young lovers as being kind of too meek to proclaim their feelings for the loved one, perhaps initially because they're worried that their feelings might not be returned, and it could be too embarrassing or too heartbreaking, but coupled with this idea of being kind of wild in their obsession, in their intense feelings. So again, this kind of contradictory language of meekness and wildness, but we can see this not just in Isabella and Lorenzo, we can see it in a tradition of other romantic characters such as Romeo and Juliet there. And it is interesting to go back to that image of Romeo and Juliet, because we know we're reminded of how much of an influence Shakespeare was on Keats, and we've seen that influence of Romeo and Juliet in the Eve of St Agnes as well. But if you think about Romeo and Juliet in relation to Isabella and Lorenzo, there are parallels that we'll go on to explore in later lessons. But I think it's quite interesting. We've talked a little bit today about the significance of night time for Lorenzo and Isabella, and how at night time Lorenzo and Isabella suffer, and it's that idea of them being parted at night time and being separate from each other. And that reminds me of Romeo and Juliet, actually, but it's a bit of an inversion of Romeo and Juliet, because for Romeo and Juliet, they savour night time because it's a time, it's the only time really when they're allowed to be together in the play, and they take solace and share their feelings in that time together, and it's really romantic times in the play. But for Lorenzo and Isabella, all of the references to nighttime are coupled with suffering, and they kind of hint at or foreshadow the darker separation that is to come later on in the poem for them. So my last activity for you is to have another look at stanzas 12 and 13, as it says on the slide there, where the narrator is, in a very self-aware way, seems to be commenting on the nature of storytelling and romance and the tradition of romance, and placing it in a tradition of thwarted love. So I'll leave you to have another look back at those two stanzas and to write down your thoughts on how what the narrator is saying affects our perception of the blossoming love between Lorenzo and Isabella, and hints again at the potential for tragedy to come. So I'm not going to really say anything about that now. I'm going to let you have a think about it and jot down your thoughts, and I'll join you next lesson. So thank you for listening, and I hope that made sense to you all and has been helpful. Thanks very much. Bye.